72 hours, Chief. Can we make it?
We don't have a choice, Lieutenant. Get that scaffolding down and the planes loaded.
May 27, 1942, Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, Oahu. Dawn came on like a knife through canvas, thin, colorless light over an anchorage that still smelled of December's burned paint. Trade winds pushed a low, what haze over Ford Island as the battered carrier slid in, lines snaking ashore, hull plates creaking with the exhaustion of a prize fighter who had stayed on his feet too long. On the flight deck, sailors of USS Yorktown, CV-5, shirts stained with oil and coral sea salt, stood quietly at the rails, watching the scabbed shoreline and the cranes that waited like patient birds of prey. From the quay, a superintendent in khakis, Commander Cyril Rick over the yard's repair division, jaw set, clipboard under his arm, squinted at the warped deck planking and the black edge seams around the island. Next to him, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz said nothing. He simply took in the carrier's limp. Patched holes, twisted stanchions, a starboard list that showed the ship's fatigue more than the tide did. On the hangar deck, Captain Elliot Buckmaster, Yorktown CO, ran a palm across the spall frame and felt the rust-brittle edge bite his skin. The coral sea had left her with cracked stringers, flooded compartments, wheezing boilers, and a flight deck punctured like old roofing. She was technically combat-capable only on paper. In the gray wash of morning, Buckmaster looked like every worn-out skipper in a Navy at war, eyes yellow with fatigue. Uniform pressed out a habit more than pride. The dockside voices began their calculus. Man-hours, plate thickness, pipe diameters, lifting capacities. The superintendent's pencil hovered over forms. 3 months. A bosun muttered to no one in particular. If we're lucky. Nimitz turned toward the men gathered there and spoke in a calm voice that cut through the shipyard clatter. You have 72 hours, he said. We sail for Midway. The sentence hung in the humid air, like a flare refusing to burn out. 3 months shrank to 3 days. A dozen eyebrows went up. The yard clock ticked once, and, as if taking the order like a signal gun, the first acetylene torch flared open. Could a broken carrier be made whole in time to meet a fleet that had not yet shown its face? By 0700, the pier side became choreography. Pearl Harbor Navy Yard men moving in squads under chalk numbers, the carrier's wounds mapped into a working plan. Yellow grease pencil-marked cracked frames, red slashes circled ruptured piping, blue X's on the flight deck pegged areas to be cut and plated. The Pearl crane swung into position with steel pallet and patience, the hook blocks dangling like pendulums. Chief Machinist Mate Red, Hanley led a gang of sailors toward the forward fire room, swinging wrenches like hammers and carrying lengths of new copper tubing over their shoulders. 2 decks above, a civilian welder, Rose Fernandez, adjusted her hood and laid a bright seam along a torn bulkhead, sparks pinging like summer hail against the steel. Inside boiler room number 2, the heat felt like a door to the equator. The engineering officer, Lieutenant Commander John Delaney, crouched with flashlight, peering at a spiderwebbing crack on a steam drum saddle. If this goes, he said to Hanley, we're a floating barn. Hanley spat into the scupper. Then it won't go. He thumped the metal with the handle of his pipe wrench and nodded to a pair of yard fitters already unbolting the strap. They would sleeve the weak point with a new clamp assembly turned in machine shop an hour earlier from a design sketched in charcoal on a packing crate lid. Up top, the flight deck groaned as men cut open a jagged hole, evidence of a near miss whose overpressure had lifted planks and bowed the underlying girders. The plan, hatched in a 5-minute huddle with the yard structural chief, was brutal and fast. Trim the bent metal, drop in 2-inch steel plates, stitch the seams with continuous welds, and brace the no. 2 elevator trunk with a temporary truss built from repurposed destroyer stock. The deck would not be pretty, but it would take a landing wheel. Pretty didn't count in 3 days. On the island, electronics men from Radio Central uncrated spare modules for the CXM, 1 air search radar. The Coral Sea had rattled the set so badly the sweep line came back with ghosts, a smear where the horizon should be. The electrician's mate second-class Abe Lerner pulled off a panel and stared at a charred connector. Looks like someone tried to toast a marshmallow in here, he said. The joke earned him a thin smile from Ensign Gracie, the radar officer, who handed him a new plug and a bundle of cable ties. Out on the taffrail, a weather whip antenna went up, lashed in place with line until proper brackets could be fabricated. VF, 3 is coming aboard, Buckmaster told the air boss at 0930, his voice crackling over the sound-powered phones. Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch and his fighter squadron were ferrying over, their F-4 Wildcats short-legged but lethal in the right hands. The Coral Sea had cost the fleet Lexington. Yorktown would carry orphans from across the Pacific now. VB-3, VS-5, and the torpedo men of VT-3, Thatch's fighters, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell, Leslie's dive bombers, and Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey's TBD Devastators, would be lashed into this patch carrier like ribs to a stitched chest. 3 days, a torpedo mechanic whispered as he set a Mark 13 warhead in its cradle. They're joking. Navy ain't joking, his partner said. Japs ain't joking either. Midday rain shouldered in from the south, drumming on the deck plates in a tempo that matched the rivet guns. Stores came aboard in muscle-racking waves. 50 calories belts in wooden crates, aviation gasoline in drums that smelled like hot pennies, fresh provisions packed in sawdust, and crates of hydraulic fluid for tired arresting gear. A truck backed to the pier with wooden pallets of 500-pound GP bombs, fuses wrapped in wax paper like candy. 2 blue jackets walked beside each pallet, one hand on a load, as if the touch alone would keep the world safe. At 1400, Buckmaster met with the yard superintendent in a makeshift office under flight deck, a table, 3 chairs, and a map of the ship's skeleton pinned to the bulkhead. The room whirred with portable generators and smelled of hot insulation. We can give you 2 boilers at 90%, the superintendent said, tapping the plan with a pencil. 3rd at 80, 4 if we keep cold. She's not fit. He raised his gaze. You won't make full speed. Buckmaster folded his arms. I don't need 32 knots, he said. I need to fly airplanes. Then we'll get you air, Captain, the superintendent said, and deck enough to land them. Evening tilted in purple and brass, the yard casting long lattice shadows across the harbor. Work lights flooded the ship in a hard white glare. Night crew rotated aboard with lunch pails and quiet faces. The torches bit into steel again, the arcs turning the humid air into a swarm of fireflies. Damage control parties moved to the bowels of Yorktown, painting fresh watermark lines around patch compartments, chalking tight on watertight doors that had passed a retest, and check on those that would have a hold for now. In the hangar, aviation machinist mates in greasy dungarees stood worshipfully before open cowls of SPD dauntless dive bombers, checking magnetos with fingertip sensitivity and timing the right R-1820 engines by ear. An old chief named Kowalski rested his hand on a cylinder head as the prop turned on a starter cart. Hear that? He said to the kid he was training. The kid shook his head, sweating in the tropical heat. That wobble. She'll cough at the top of the dive if you don't fix it. And we're going to a place where coughing gets you killed. By midnight, the conversation within Yorktown had shifted from weather to how long until we're ready. The air group officers posted aboard near the ready room. Launch cycles, deck spots, fuel ladders, a rough plan for a battle most of them had only heard about in whispers. Midway, a dot in the ocean, sand, scrub, a runway and a radio, somewhere 1,000 miles north and west of everything that felt safe. Admiral Raymond Spruance and Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher were out there assembling pieces. Enterprise and Hornet already at sea. The ocean itself a chessboard of hull wakes and vapor trails the color of lightning. Day 2 began with a whistle and the sudden hush that follows when a machine goes quiet. In boiler room number 2, the pumps had stopped. The overhaul was at a stage where silence implied risk. A yard engineer, sleeves rolled, slid down a ladder with a bag of gaskets and a look that said sleep had not visited. We got a bad flange, he told Delaney. Warped from heat. Delaney rubbed his eyes. We can true it? We can, but we need an hour in the shop. You have 40 minutes, Delaney said, not unkindly. Above, ordnance worked on the TBDs, the Devastators' bellies gaping open to receive torpedoes that every man distrusted and every man would arm anyway. The Mark 13 had a temper. It porpoised, it ran shallow, it broke on impact if thrown too fast. Treat it gentle, the ordnance chief said. She's a lady with a pistol in her purse. When one of the younger sailors chuckled, the chief stared him quiet. The laughter curled up and died in the heat. Throughout the day, eyes flicked to the radar repeater on the island, the sweep turning like a slow heartbeat. Ensign Gracie watched the phosphor line and thought of the ghosts at Coral Sea, of blips that grew into dive bombers, and the long seconds between sighting and impact. He kept his voice steady when he spoke, but when he paused, he caught himself pressing thumb and forefinger together so hard the nail beds whitened. "We'll see them first this time," he murmured. "We have to." Skepticism floated in from every compartment. Quiet, respectful, but present. 3 months of work crammed into 3 days. Men traded favors, borrowed tools, sent messengers running for parts that had walked across the ship already in someone else's hands. The shipfitters told the welders that if they could hold a seam together for 90 seconds, a brace would follow. The riggers promised to lift a 30-foot plate, and instead raised 2. The painters, God bless them, rolled gray over the raw metal, so the sea wouldn't eat it whole. No one said impossible anymore. They just spoke in the logic of hours. On the bridge, Buckmaster and his executive officer, Commander Dixie Kiefer, set watches as if underway already. "We'll run drills tonight," Kiefer said. Sound-powered phones, fire mains, flight quarters silent. He paused, a grin creasing weathered cheeks. "Let's see if the lady remembers how to dance." At 1800 on the second day, as the sun bled sideways under clouds and turned the harbor copper, the flight deck shuddered with the first engine run-ups. Wildcat and Dauntless prop wash beat down the work crews' caps and tore at their shirts. A yard welder lifted her hood and leaned back against a stanchion, letting the gusts cool her face. The sound, high and primal, the rumble of radio engines tuned to purpose, rolled across the anchorage and set every gull to flight. It felt like breath returning to a chest. Near midnight, Buckmaster walked alone along the starboard catwalk, stepping around coils of line and stacks of timber. He stopped at the edge of the patch deck section, placed his hand on the new steel, and felt the faint heat still in the plate. He looked toward the black line of the horizon beyond the harbor mouth. Out there, somewhere, were the first carrier striking force of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and an idea of fate the Pacific seemed determined to test. 3 days, he whispered, a statement more than a prayer. 3 days. A klaxon barked once, just a test, and went quiet. He turned and went below to sleep for 45 minutes. May 29th, 1942, Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, just before dawn. A light rain prickled the dark, salt-laced air. Work lamps cast hard cones of white across Yorktown's patch deck, turning beads of water into quicksilver. In the island, the CXM, one radar hummed faintly, the sweep circling like a tired lighthouse beam. Ensign Gracie leaned over a repeater, a cigarette cupped in his hand against the night breeze, and watched the line cut its soft green arc below him. In boiler room number 2, a valve wheel shrieked as it was hauled shut, then open again, the sound of metal complaining under orders. Someone cursed. Someone laughed. The ship seemed to take those sounds and then breathed back a question. Are we enough? The third day began at a trot. At 0400 yard, tug nosed up alongside to pass additional line for a shoreside steam supply, a safeguard while the final gasket set. Lieutenant Commander Delaney had been in the machinery spaces so long his eyes were adjusting to the world in shades of boiler gray. He braced a hand against a warm bulkhead while a junior machinist read off a gauge, voice steady. Feed to 150. Holding. Bring her to 170, Delaney said. Slow. Don't spook her. In the aft elevator trunk. Shipfitters threaded a last diagonal brace into a place where a frame had cracked like an old bone. Rose Fernandez swung the sledge and seated the shoe with a ringing note that made heads lift all along the catwalk. Sparks hissed into rain. That's the one that stays, she told the apprentice, and he nodded with the solemnity of a man swearing to a secret. At 0615, the air department called topside for a silent rehearsal. Chalk lines down the patch planking to mark deck spots. Yellow shirts with paddles walking wildcats forward by hand. A dauntless roll to the after end to check clearance against a new guardrail that looked suspiciously like it had been cut from a destroyer's bulwark. The air boss, sleeves rolled and eyes cold, watched every movement. "If you can do it quiet, you can do it loud," he said. "On the day, it'll be loud." In the ready room, the skepticism that had dogged every step took human shape. Pilots who hadn't flown off his deck before, crew chiefs praying their engines would make rated power, ordnance men nursing a weapons locker they didn't entirely trust. Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch stood at a chalkboard with a stub of white in his fingers. He drew 2 X's, 2 O's, and a set of converging arrows. "We're going to fly pairs," he said. "If they bounce a lead, the wingman cuts across. Thatch weave. Nobody chases glory. You keep your head. Kill the zero's turn by forcing him to overshoot." The room, VF, 3, but also strays folded into the mix, shifted forward in their chairs. A pilot in the back, cap low, asked the only question that mattered, "Will it work?" Thatch didn't smile. "It worked in practice. It'll work when it matters if you do it together." In ordnance, skepticism had a weight and a fuse. The Mark 13 torpedo lay on trestles like a sleeping alligator. Chief Ordnance Man Pappy Dugan ran a cloth over the warhead's ogive. "Fuses are temperamental," he told the new man. "Depth gears, too. We keep the drop speed down. Gentle entry." The new man swallowed. "Sir, what's gentle at 100 knots?" Pappy shrugged, eyes dry. "As gentle as you can lie to a torpedo." By mid-morning, Nimitz came again. No entourage, just a rain-darkened hat and a quiet that followed him like a shadow. He walked the hangar deck, touched a newly welded stiffener with 2 fingers, then looked up to the flight deck cutout where a plate seemed shown like a new scar. Captain Buckmaster and Commander Kiefer fell in beside him. "She'll fly, Admiral," Buckmaster said. Nimitz nodded once. "She must." He stopped at a Wildcat with its cowl open. "What's her name?" A plane captain with oil to his elbows said, "Sir?" "The airplane," Nimitz said mildly. The sailor flushed. "Ma'am, sir." Nimitz's mouth twitched. "Then treat her as one." He left them with that and stepped out into the rain. Afternoon brought the proof of heat. At 1300, Delaney gave the word. "Light fires in number 1 and no." The fire rooms went bright. Flames licked through oil sprayers, and the air shifted from damp to living, hot, alive, metallic. Pressure rose. On the engine order telegraph, the handle clacked from stop to ahead slow, not to turn screws, but to stir the ship's blood. In the after-steering compartment, a seaman ran his hand over the wheel's bronze spokes and felt the vibration settle into the deck. Yorktown had a pulse. Above, Ensign Gracie and his radar gang tuned the set against clutter coming off the Kolar range. He tapped the Evgane, rolled the time base, and watched the smeared echoes resolve into something a man could bet his life on. A blip wander at 15 miles. Birds? A patrol boat? He logged it, checked the transmitter temp, and called down to the island's plotting board. "Paint's good," he said softly. "We'll see, Em." Skepticism became a rhythm more than a complaint. "Can we really go?" Turned into do this next. Crates of 20mm Oerlikon magazines appeared where no one remembered requesting them, and a pair of new 1-inch mounts received improvised splinter shields knocked together by the shipfitters from whatever plate they could steal. Bosun's mates lashed spare timber along exposed conduits. Signal men re-rigged yardarms with lines that didn't squeal in wind. If something could be done in one way, they found 2. That evening, Buckmaster convened a last operations huddle in a corner of the wardroom, hull plates pinging as they cooled on the other side of the bulkhead. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie of VB, 3 leaned over the chart of the Midway sector, a rectangle Pacific that had all the personality of a blank page. "We launch on scout vectors here, and here," he said, tapping with his pencil. "If we find them, we mark with smoke and stay high. We don't descend until we've got the picture." Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey of VT, 3, kept his counsel, eyes on the torpedo track calculations. He knew his devastators would be slow and low, the kind of target every Zero pilot dreamed about. When he spoke, it was just to say, "We'll go together, May 30th, 1942 broke quick and brittle, sunlight slicing through the last of the ragged clouds. A band from a nearby tender tried to find March, notes coming thin over the chop. At 0900, the final yard tags came off valves and switches, some replaced by pencil notes, some by faith. Buckmaster signed the readiness report. The superintendent from the yard, eyes red-rimmed, held out his hand. "She'll get there," he said. Buckmaster squeezed his grip. "You got her this far." Lines were singled up. The tug backed, churning white. Yorktown, paint still fresh on some plates, old coral sea scars hiding under others, eased away from the pier and into the channel. On the island, the ensign snapped and then ran out clean on the gaff. Men who had swung hammers and burned rods for 3 sleepless nights stood shoulder to shoulder along the quay and didn't wave. They stood like judges and fathers, watching the ship they had remade slide toward open ocean. The skepticism followed her into the Pacific, but at a distance now, like a gull that just couldn't decide whether to land. Boilers held. Bearing temperatures stayed within limits. A slight vibration at 20 knots made coffee cups sing, but the engineers chalked it as acceptable and the boatswain stowed the cups. Yorktown set her westerly course to rendezvous with Task 416 and Task 417, the sea widening into a blue so pure it seemed cruel. On the flight deck, the air group shook itself into routine. VF-3 cycle practice launches, roll, lift, wheels tapped the patch plate. Then trapped again, hooks squealing against their resting wires as if reluctant to stop. VB-3's Dauntless lifted in pairs to mark bearings on the horizon and returned with engines ticking hot as they shut down. Steel's holding, the air boss reported. She lands like a proper ship. Below decks, the mess line told its own story. Eyes ringed with sleepless nights now starting to blink slow, hands eating with purpose rather than adrenaline. A cook slid a tray across to Red Hanley and said, "You done?" Hanley took a bite, nodded toward the deck, and grinned without much humor. Ship's turn now. Late afternoon of the 30th. Buckmaster stood on the bridge wing, under a cap that never quite fit right. Commander Kiefer had the con. "Steady on 270, Kiefer said. The horizon wore its thin line of cloud like a secret. Off to the northeast, a pair of destroyers stitched white V's into the sea. Farther yet, an oilier smudge, their own smoke, hung back astern. Signal came up from the mast, message from Admiral Fletcher. Rendezvous on designated point. Maintain radio silence. Buckmaster read it, folded it once, and slid it into his pocket. Dusk brought the first drill at sea. General quarters. The kind of full-body test that had no patience left for hypotheticals. The klaxon hammered its single-minded call. Men went to stations on muscle memory and map. In radio, a radio man second class threaded a headset and listened to the ocean static. In combat information, the radar sweep drew a clean circle and found nothing but weather. On the after-aid gallery, a loader set a 20mm drum with metallic clack and smiled when the feed pawl cycled just as the manual said it would. "Stand down," the loudspeaker finally announced. Steele sighed. Night swallowed the ocean with a finality that only the Pacific can manage. Stars came out like ice chips in black velvet. On the hangar deck, a chaplain sat with a group of men on overturned ammo crates and read in a level voice. No theatrics, just words set adrift on diesel and salt. No one asked what tomorrow would bring. The ship already knew the business at hand. May 31st, the 4th day since Pearl, brought company. Just after noon, lookouts called mass off the western quarter, and soon the sea lifted 3 dark forms out of the horizon. Enterprise, Hornet, and their escorts, steel cities moving with intent. Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance signaled greetings. Yorktown lifted hers in reply. Bridges flashed discreet light across the miles, mid-ocean semaphore in a language made for long distances and short truths. Task 416 and Task 417 knitted together with the practicality of men who had work and little time. On Yorktown's flight deck, Thatch walked a line of wildcats, touching each cowling, each tire. A plane captain spoke low. "Sir, she's ready." Thatch gave the man a glance that said both "thank you" and "you're coming with me" in the same breath. He climbed onto Ma'am and settled into the cockpit, hands roaming switches. as if they were pages in a familiar book. Engines coughed, caught, and settled into that confident radial rumble that made even the sea seem to square its shoulders. The skepticism had not vanished. It had evolved into focus. Doubters had become doers, and doers had become the ship's pulse. In the plotting room, grease pencils mapped arcs of possible enemy approach. In the galley, knives clocked against cutting boards with the tempo of a clean, necessary ritual. In the torpedo shop, Pappy Dugan tightened one last safety wire and blew out his breath. "Good girl," he said to the Mark 13. "Don't embarrass me." Evening again, and a last quiet before the storm that no one could see, but everyone could feel. Sailors leaned on railings and stared at the useless romance of a beautiful sea. Somewhere out there, over a curve no chart could flatten, the keto butai was coming, and with it the test that would either justify 3 days of miracles or write their names into a column no one wanted to read. On the bridge, Buckmaster checked the log, then looked to Kiefer. "You ever think a ship can want to fight?" Kiefer's grin was that of a man who trusted steel only so far. "I think she wants to prove herself, Captain." Buckmaster nodded once. "We'll give her the chance." The night air cooled, the rain gone, wind carrying a clean edge from the northeast. Midway lay beyond the dark, a sandbar-turned fortress by grit, radio, and luck. Yorktown held her station in the formation, patched seams and new paint indistinguishable under starlight. 3 days ago she had limped into Pearl like a wounded prizefighter. Now she moved like a boxer rolling his shoulders, remembering reach and footwork, drawing breath for the bell. Somewhere deep in the ship, a valve ticked. Somewhere high, a halyard snapped a soft beat on the mast. Between those notes, in a silence that felt earned, men allowed themselves one last private thought. Let the work hold. Let the training matter. Let the ship be enough. June 4th, 1942, north of Midway Atoll, pre-dawn. Wind combed low swells into Cat's paws under a clean, starlit sky. The carrier USS Yorktown rode the dark with her running lights blanked, steel whispering to itself. In the island, the CXM, one radar warmed to life. Ensign Gracie rubbed sleep from his eyes and watched the sweep arc, like a second hand no clock could own. On the bridge, Captain Elliot Buckmaster cradled a mug that had cooled hours ago and studied the horizon as if it might confess something. At 0430, voice on the sound-powered phones broke the hush. Midway reports bogeys many, bearing 3-0. The ship changed, as if a muscle tightened along her keel. Wind shifted. Men straightened. The day had come. If this was the ambush Nimitz had wagered, would Yorktown's 3 days of borrowed miracles be enough to spring it? The claxons rasped tore through steel and bone, general quarters. Compartments blossomed with motion. In combat information, a grease pencil scrawled fresh arcs on the plotting board. Lookouts blinked into gray where night thinned into a pale rim along the east. In the ready rooms, pilots strapped in while their crewmen leaned close for last words that were not speeches. Good engine. Watch your temps. Check your lap belt before the dive. I'll be here when you get back. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, with his flag in Yorktown, weighed reports as they came like weather, Midway-based PBYs calling sighting after sighting. The atoll's own defenses lighting the morning with columns of tracer. Over the voice circuit came the first note of certainty. Enemy carriers sighted. Coordinates slid across paper with the finality of a judge's signature. On the flight deck, propellers bit the day. VF-3's F-4F Wildcats barked to life under Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch, the air around them vibrating with radio confidence. VB-3's SBD Dauntless under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell. Leslie stood with canopies open, pilots' eyes hooded against the wind. VD-3's TBD Devastators, slower and older, weighted with torpedoes that looked too heavy for hope and too necessary for doubt. The air boss paced the catwalk with a paddled authority that made every plane captain's gestures a syllable in a language of necessity. Launch. Wildcats first. Throttles forward, tail lifts, wheels kiss the patch plate, and then air. The Wildcats arced into a tough, practical wedge. Pairs set for the thatch weave if the Zeros chose to pounce. Behind them, Dauntless rolled, one after another, the decametronome of resolve. Leslie checked his gauges and, for a moment, let his gaze slide across the patch seam midships. The plate hot from sun and memory. Hold, he thought. Hold for us. Yorktown swung to make wind, her patched deck taking on the holy work of putting wings where wings needed to be. Below, Lieutenant Commander Delaney's engineers nursed the boilers with steady heartbeat that kept the slipstream honest. In the radar shack, Gracie called ranges with fighter direction officer. Thus became lines. Lines became a picture of the morning. Midway's land-based torpedo and dive bomber strikes were already ravaging the patience of the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, drawing Zeros low and outward in chasing, wasteful arcs. The sky filled with rumors. Planes seen, planes lost, Midway's Marine SBDs and B-20s punching through a ring of fire only to slam fragments of failure and courage back into the sea. Yorktown held her fighters poised and her bombers high, husbanding strength for the strike that would matter. Fletcher, reading the wind of reports, measured the moment and committed. Orders ran. Yorktown to launch her strike. It would be a hunt, not a certainty, course lines and dead reckoning. A wager on where the enemy would be, not where it had last been seen. Leslie's VB. 3 climbed into the pale and thin blue, engines drumming in obedient unison. He led them not as a lecturer, but as a man who knew that altitude made choices, and that choices made outcomes. VD-3, under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, took its own low, stubborn path, a line of silver against a blue so wide it looked pitiless. Wildcat to VF, 3 darted between roles. Screen, scout, shepherd. In cockpits, men fixed compasses and scanned for a horizon that would yield more than sea. Just after 1,000. A glint, then more. Sunlight caught on something not water. Carriers, 3 flat, patient beasts trailing ribbons awake. Leslie's voice went to steel. There they are. Soryu, Kaga, Akagi, the core of a striking force that had burned Pearl Harbor into memory. Over the same minutes, to the south and east, Enterprise's dive bombers under Wade McCluskey and Richard Best were falling on Kaga and Akagi, turning moments into history with precision that still sounds like a rumor when told plain. Leslie Edge VB, 3 toward Soryu, a decision born of angle and distance and instinct hammered into clarity by training. He felt the aircraft change when the dive flaps bit. The world pivoted on the line of his canopy rail. Altitude unwound in bright numbers along the altimeter's face. The Soryu grew, deck a narrow taupe rectangle border by white water, and bristling with gun pits that spat black into the sky. AA burst pocked the air, crump, crump, black petal that grew and passed. Steady, Leslie said to no one in particular, and all of them at once. He counted the dive by habit. 12, 10, 8,000 feet. Release. The Dauntless jumped as the bomb let go, awaited decision leaving the airplane. Tracer stitched past, bright cursive writing nobody wanted to read. Flaps up. Pull. The aircraft shuddered, complaining in metal and air, and then lifted, free again. Behind him, bombs found Soryu. 3 solid hits, aft, amidships, forward. Fire blooming in a sequence that turned the carrier's deck into a kiln. Flames gout from hangar vents where fueled and armed aircraft had been waiting for permission that would never come. Smoke lifted like a judge's robe and fell back again in pronouncement. Soryu lurched, slowed, and began to carry a ruin that would end her life before the day did. Leslie glanced back once and then didn't. The business was done, and now came the practice of getting home. Flak found one of the squadron. Another took splinters and kept flying, a canopy star like ice, but the pilot steady. The radio came alive with fragments, hit, on fire, zeros 10 o'clock, and then wove itself back into discipline as they clawed for altitude and east. Meanwhile, Yorktown was not only striking, she was defending. The radar shack caught a new shape in the air, an inbound wave. Hiryu, spared by the morning's chaos, had launched her own riposte. IHED 3A Val dive bombers with zero escort, a vengeful brushstroke headed straight for the name Yorktown painted high on the island. VF 3 climbed to meet them. In that meeting, the math of skepticism and faith became tactics with teeth. Thatch led his fighters in pairs, the maneuver he had trained into muscle memory from chalkboard lines and island practice. Two Wildcats crossed back and forth, forcing the more nimble Zero to overshoot into a coneware. 50 caliber slugs carved decisions into aluminum and flesh. Weave! Weave! Thatch called, voice flat with intention. A Zero slid long under a Wildcat's wing. The wingman filled the space with bullets. The Zero folded like paper and went down in a spiral that ended in a brief, white puncture spray. The Thatch weave, once a diagram, now became salvation in 3 dimensions. Still, enough valves broke through to make weather over Yorktown. Around 12:20, Siren slashed the sky and the deck crew, drilled to the second, made the ship a smaller target. Hard rudder, burst of speed, as much as the patch boilers would spare. Smoke screen laid by escorts. The first bomb fell wide, the second close, the third found. A bright, white flash dead center near the stack. Concussion hit like a wall. Light bulbs shattered in compartments 6 decks down. Men tasted pain in the air as particles became dust in their teeth. Another bomb struck near the forward elevator. A near miss lifted plates and shook the ship in her bones. Fire parties ran before the flames could. CO2 hissed. Hoses snaked, boots clanged. On the bridge, Buckmaster's jaw set and his voice stayed level. All engines answer. 2 and 3 answering, sir, came the reply. Very well. Yorktown did not stop. Within minutes it felt like hours. Damage control proved what 3 days of work had promised. The ship bled, but the blood would not pour out. List corrected. Power returned. Smoke thinned to a manageable fury. The flight deck, scar again, insulted by physics and hate, came back to purpose. The signal lamp blinked steady, as if it had never known another speed. Hiryu, wild with the loss of her sisters, sent torpedo bombers. Yorktown's radar painted them at distance. The fighter director sent what Wildcats he could spare. The AA batteries trained in arcs that made geometry personal. 1-inch mounts clattered. 20 millimeters Ehrlichons chattered like anger expressed in metal. Devastators of VT-3, committed to their own impossible run earlier against Hiryu, met the flensing knives of Zeros over blue water. Lance Massey took his squadron low and straight into a history that would remember the courage even as it lamented the result. Wildcats clawed to cover them. The sky became a tangle of smoke and contrails and moving fire. Yorktown's men on the gallery mounts watched thin biplane silhouettes plunge at the horizon and prayed at a pace that matched their trigger pulls. They came, the torpedo planes that made every shipman's dream shallow, spreading left and right to split the carrier's attention. Buckmaster's order snapped. Hard left, then hard right, a dance with physics and fate, screws digging at water that had no interest in helping. 2 wakes appeared starboard like white pencil marks drawing conclusion. Yorktown heeled to meet them, a full-body flinch against inevitability. The first torpedo missed. The second and third struck starboard, deep, gut punches that roll her hard over and killed the lights like a hand on a switch. Steam screamed. The ship groaned in a voice men would hear again in their sleep. Engineering. Power loss, sir. We're dark. Counter flood. Buckmaster said. Keep her alive. Men moved in the dark by habit and touch. Damage control cracked lanterns, opened valves, shut others, and wrote on bulkheads with chalk as if the ship could read its own prescriptions. Pumps took up a new rhythm. The list eased from 26 degrees to something a man could walk against without crawling. Someone laughed, a single astonished bark, when a bank of lights flickered back on. It sounded like defiance. In the air, VB, 3 and surviving VF. 3 assets limped home to a deck that was both itself and more than itself, a promise manifest in steel. Leslie, fuel low and thought spare, called the pattern. Yorktown VB-3 returning. The paddle's officer answered with a calm he manufactured for the occasion. Bring them, bring them. Wheels kissed steel. Hooks caught wire. The ship brought her children home even as she steadied her own breath. Afternoon waned. Reports congealed into a picture. 3 of the enemy's carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, were burning out their lives on the far side of the morning. 1, Hiryu, still struck back, dangerous as a cornered animal. The turning point had come not in one grand, symmetric gesture, but in the unspooling of many small, mortal choices. A dive angle held a fraction longer, a rudder order given a second sooner, a weld that did not crack. A radar image read with confidence. Yorktown stood in the center of it, not immaculate but sufficient, patched, bruised, awake. On the bridge wing, smoke in his hair and salt dry in a fine film on his face, Buckmaster looked across his ship. Commander, Dixie, Kiefer leaned on the rail, eyes following the escorting destroyers as they closed the screen tighter. "She's still with us," Kiefer said softly. Buckmaster nodded, a short, grateful gesture. "And we with her." The sun slid lower, gilding the patched deck until the scars looked like veins of ore. Men exhaled one long collective breath, and then drew another. The day was not done. But the ocean had shifted, subtly, decisively, around a carrier that had arrived from the edge of repair to help break the enemy's spear. June 4th, 1942, 1,500 hours north of Midway. Smoke hung in veils across Yorktown's wake, the Pacific wind tearing strips from it and throwing them low over the water. The ship listed, then steadied, then listed again, like a man stubbornly refusing a second knee to the canvas. On the gallery deck, a loader patted a hot 20mm Oerlikon barrel and whispered, "Easy." Below, in a passageway lit by emergency lanterns, Lieutenant Commander Delaney chalked valve orders on a bulkhead with a carpenter's blunt pencil. A messenger stood ready with a sound-powered phone line snaked around his neck like a second set of arteries. Over the circuit came a report everyone leaned toward, power returning partial. A breath moved through steel. If this ship could be kept alive, the battle might yet tilt from desperate to decided. But somewhere beyond the haze, Hiryu still hunted, and Yorktown's patched heart had to prove it could take one more blow. On the bridge, Captain Elliot Buckmaster squared himself to the deck's slow roll. Counterflood confirmed, came the voice from Damage Control Central. List easing to 15. It wasn't pretty seamanship, more like field medicine, but the ship began to come back onto an even keel. Men who had wedged themselves sideways against bulkheads to move now found they could stand. Vent fans coughed alive. The smell shifted from hot paint and steam to salt air and sweat and something like hope. Down on the hangar deck, crews pushed aside twisted ducting so that SBD's Limping home could ride the elevator safely. A plain captain in a salt-streaked cap dragged a length of hose toward a Dauntless that had landed with its flaps trembling like an exhausted bird. "We got you," he said to the airplane, as if it could hear him, as if metal would answer the tenderness. By then, reports from the fleet net scattered a new kind of electricity through the ship. Enterprise's dive bombers, guided by fragments of sighting and the bitter instinct of men who had already lost friends that morning, had found Hiryu. In the late day's sun, their bombs walked up her deck, turning the carrier's careful geometry into a furnace. Out on Yorktown's bridge wing, Commander Dixie, Kiefer listened to the clipped confirmations. He rubbed a greasy thumb along the rim of his binoculars and allowed himself the smallest breath. "That'll do," he said. "That'll do." He caught Buckmaster's eye. No theatrics passed between them, only the exchange of men who knew a corner had been turned. But corners on the Pacific have long shadows. Hiryu did not die clean. She had already loosed her last sting, B-5 and Kate, torpedo bombers, and those insect of fate were on their way, running low and mean over a sea cut into hard facets by afternoon breeze. Radar painted the smears. Fighter direction sent wildcats to bite. AA crews trained by instinct and geometry. "Stand by to engage," the gunnery officer called, and the air around the ship filled with a braided roar. The clatter of the 1-inch Chicago pianos, the staccato snarl of 20 mm, the deeper, throatier commentary of 5-inch/38 S-time to proximity fuses and prayer. Around 1600, the Kates came in split left and right, textbook spread, the kind of tactic that turned the carrier into a decision she can't fully answer. Buckmaster saw the V of wakes and did the only thing he could. Right full rudder, flank speed. She answered as best she could on patched boilers, her bow churning white. Screws throwing up a hard blue that smelled of brine and violence. The first torpedo slid by close aboard, a white ghost rolling its eyes at them as it passed. The next two did not. They hit starboard with a pair of dull, killing thumps, deep where the ship kept her balance and her soul. The deck leapt. The island windows crazed into frosted lace. Down in the guts, men were tossed into ladders and onto pipes that had no softness in them. Steam screamed. A sound flesh isn't built to hear twice. Engineering. Buckmaster's voice knifed into the din. We're dark again, sir. 2 and 3 flooded. Came the reply. Too calm to be anything but courage. Very well. Buckmaster said, the syllables falling into their places like tools set on a bench. Counter flood port. Prepare to abandon if we lose the fight. The next half hour became the kind of arithmetic that wore forces onto men. Watertight doors battened. Shoring hammered under bulkheads that groaned like trees in a winter storm. Bucket brigades where pumps failed. Prayers where buckets would never suffice. The list crept toward 26 degrees, a tilt that made steel decks into hills. Yet she did not roll over. Damage control found the ship's new center and hauled her toward it with valves and sweat and 1,000 small choices. But the engineer sent a final verdict. No propulsion, no immediate chance of power. Fires controlled for now, but the ship too wounded to stand a third assault. Buckmaster looked down his bridge at men whose faces were ash-white with fatigue and streaked with oil. He thought like a captain who loved his ship and men in the same way, with a sense for when to hold and when to let go. He lifted the handset. All hands, prepare to abandon ship. This is precautionary. The word precautionary saved lives. It told men to be deliberate, not frantic, to think of ladders and lines, and to pass the word to the one who hadn't heard. It told them there might be a return. Boats went down. Rafts were thrown. Destroyers slid in with practiced grace to take on the drift of men, who stepped off the sponsons with their life jackets high on their chests. A sailor named Bert Shorty Mendez, no rank needed for truth of him, paused at the top of a ladder, palm against the warm paint of the island, and whispered, "Hold on." Then he went, boots first, into the small, hard mercy of the sea. Hughes, Morris Anderson, and other escorts plucked men up like stern fathers. No coddling, just hands that did not slip. On the flight deck, the last aircraft were shoved to the edge and chocked to keep them from rolling into men below. A pilot who had found his way back to Yorktown and found her broken now found himself on a destroyer's deck, teeth chattering with adrenaline cold, eyes still searching the horizon for threats, as if duty were a muscle that couldn't unclench. Night came. The sea smoothed to a dark skin. Task 417 withdrew. Yorktown rode alone with a skeleton watch and a single prayer that she would still be there in the morning to be saved. June 5th dawned pale over a carrier stubbornly afloat. The ocean had agreed for a time to the bargain struck by her builders and her crew. Into that covenant came new actors. The tug USS Vireo at 144, nosing with workmanlike patience, and the destroyer USS Hammond DD-412 lay alongside to lend power and pumps. Men crossed the gap in steady files, carrying hoses and cables and the quiet competence of salvage sailors who know that heroics are just another word for applied plumbing. Hammond took lines, eased fenders, and brought portable pumps across, their exhaust snapping blue and blue-white in the strong morning light. A brow bridged the carrier's breaths. The salvage officer walked his route, finger-tapping checklists that would have done credit to a machinist's soul. Plugged his deck seam, shore that bulkhead, rig, towing bridle. Vireo paid out hawser, a rope so fat a man could lie across it and feel it thrum like a bass string when it took strain. Hours became a rhythm. Pump, check, plug, shore, and the list eased by the stubborn arithmetic of gallons moved from where they killed to where they were merely inconvenient. June 6th, late afternoon. The ocean, having given up a victory, decided it wanted a scene. 168, an Imperial Japanese submarine under Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, threaded a path through the destroyer screen with the malice of a needle content to take its time. Lookout scanned. Sonar men listened. The Pacific kept most of its secrets. 168 slid close enough that when she raised her periscope, the lens must have caught men's faces sharp, as if on a postcard. She loosed 4 torpedoes at murderously short range. The first struck Hammond amidships, the little destroyer shuddering like a bird hit mid-flight. She broke almost in 2, went down hard by the middle, and then, worst of all, her armed depth charges cooked off in a secondary explosion that walked a hard knuckle across Yorktown's hanging wounds. Men who had been running lines were thrown flat. Cables snapped like whips. Water leapt green-white between the ships. A second and a third torpedo hit Yorktown on the port side. New holes that undid the stubborn math of the past day. One fish, by some combination of angle and luck, passed under. It didn't matter. The ship groaned in a tone like grief. Abandoned ship. Abandoned ship. The order carried no editorials now. Hammond went quickly, stern up, men sliding and leaping and being thrown clear. Destroyers closed to take them on with nets and boat hooks, and swearing that was at once profanity and prayer. On Yorktown, lines were cut, hoses let go. Vireo cast off the bridle she had nursed like a miracle and backed her way into a welter of boiling sea. And yet, Yorktown did not give up the ghost. Through another night she floated, stripped of power, stripped of pretense, T-squared and broken and refusing, carried by the same stubborn physics that let steel flow at all, volume, displacement, the mercy compartments not yet met by water. A few men remained, moving carefully through tilted, lantern-lit spaces that smelled of oil, salt, and the hot dust of paint powder. They listened to the ship's slow, tired speech and took it down in notebooks as if attentive listening could be a kind of help. Before dawn, June 7th, the horizon wore a thin bruise of light. A swell rolled through, gentler than the day deserved. Yorktown heeled a few degrees more, and then held a boxer's final sway. Steel gave its quiet farewells, rivet by rivet, seam by seam. A man on Vireo's deck took off his cap and said to no one, "She's going." Another answered, "Aye." They watched because there was nothing else to do that wasn't a lie. She rolled further, slowly, like a choice, then turned on her side. The island went over with a stately, heartbreaking inevitability. The great gray plane of the flight deck became a wall that caught the new sun and flashed once. And then Yorktown slid bow first, a dark geometry folding into the brighter one beneath. Bubbles rose, large as barrels, cracking like distant drums. Oil made a rainbow that had no business being beautiful. For a long minute, there was only the sound of water rearranging itself. Then the destroyer's engines came back up, and voices, always voices, took over where steel had stopped. Men stared at the place where she had been, and tried to fix it in memory as something more than a coordinate. Hammond survivors were past blankets and coffee that could not do anything about the shaking, but honored it. The salvage officer closed his notebook and, with a pencil already dull, wrote, "Sank." He underlined it once, hard. Yorktown had proved every question set before her. Proof measured not in neat theorems, but in patched steel and spent lives in a battle turned by men who refused to accept the math handed to them. She had sailed on 72 hours of borrowed time to help crack the spear that had bloodied the Pacific, and then had taken her final exam with grace. The ocean, never sentimental, kept her, even as the wake smoothed and the rainbow thinned. Task Force 16 and the remnant of Task Force 17 turned their bows toward a future none of them could see. The word Midway would come to mean many things: ambush, intelligence, courage, luck. But for men who had swung hammers in pearl and slung hoses in a listing passageway and kept their hands steady on throttles that had no power left to give, it would also mean this: work that held long enough for history to change his mind. The sea heaved once, as if settling a blanket. Somewhere after where she had gone down, a piece of wreckage tapped gently against Vireo's hull, with on steel a polite knock from yesterday. June 8th, 1942, Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, Oahu. A dawn squall slid across the harbor and then moved on, leaving the cranes beaded with water and the piers smelling of wet wood and cutting oil. Rose Fernandez, the welder who had stitched Yorktown's wounds 3 days and 3 nights without sleeping right, stood on the quay with a lunch pail she didn't open. She looked at the empty berth. Fresh paint on the fenders, chalk still ghosting the timbers where a massive hull had leaned, and heard only gulls and the slap of small waves. On a clipboard at her side, a yard clerk penciled a single word under the ship's name. Not a speech, not a eulogy, just a record, missing. "Think they'll bring her back?" the clerk asked, not looking up. Rose kept her eyes on the place where steel had been. "We already did," she said softly. "Long enough. In the days after Midway, the Navy did what living Navy does when a fight ends. Counted, wired, mended, learned. Telegrams staggered across the country like travelers who had slept in their seats, sentences short and unadorned, stopping at kitchens and porches and small-town post offices. Hammond's families met double-edged news. Gallantry, then a sudden, terrible end. The depth charges they had set to kill submarines had torn the air after the sinking and taken men who had already survived the torpedo. On destroyer decks, survivors wrapped in navy blue blankets watched rain draw diagonal lines across a flat, forgiving sea and tried to stitch the last 48 hours into a narrative that could be born. One of them, Bert Shorty Mendez, turned a chipped mug in his hands and whispered to no one, "We left her twice." The chief beside him said, "She left on her own terms." At Sejapak, Admiral Chester Nimitz read reports that came in fragments and then in a body. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Iryu, 4 flat tops that had seemed immortal the day they burned Pearl Harbor, now gone. The map on his wall, prickled with pins and lengths of twine, did not change complexion. Oceans do not yield their scale for anyone. But the room itself felt different. Its air lighter, its clock ticks easier. The victory telegram he sent upward was careful, exact, uncelebratory. He knew the Pacific still had years of arithmetic ahead. On Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance wrote in the same voice he fought with, precise, quiet, with the moral authority of a man who had neither sought to fight nor shirked it. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who had flown his flag in Yorktown, closed his log with final entry on the carrier's condition, the handwriting firm right up to the sentence that stopped. Captain Elliot Buckmaster made the rounds of destroyers and tugs, looking into faces of men he now knew in a way peacetime never requires. A pilot with singed eyebrows and a raw laugh. A machinist mate who had remembered the right valve by feel in the dark. A signalman who had spelled out abandon with a steady lamp while his hands shook. Buckmaster said little. Command had taught him that the right words are often just the exact ones, spoken once. Back at Pearl, the yard men cleaned their torches and put away their sledgehammers. The supervisor initialed time cards that read like confessions. 72 hours. FLT deck patch, boiler clamps, radar realignment. Men sign in pencil because ink dries too slow. Someone tacked a scrap of plate to a post and scratched into it with a center punch. CV5. We got you there. Rose ran her fingertip over the letters and left a gray smear. The pilots of VF3, VB3, and the battered remnants of VT3 were parceled out to fresh decks and new air groups. Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch kept teaching his weave until it was no longer a tactic with a man's name, but doctrine with number. Maxwell Leslie wrote a report in which the word altitude appeared like a refrain. It would echo through every SBD brief that followed. In torpedo shops from Hawaii to San Diego, ordnance chiefs took wrenches to Mark 13s with kind of fended love. And within months the warhead's failures would be seared, shimmed, fin caged, and corrected enough that the same fish which had humiliated men at Midway would run truer in later fights. Nothing in a Navy stands still if it can help it. Ensign Gracie, the radar officer, sat at a scarred desk under a humming fan and wrote the longest, dullest, most consequential memo of his life, a list of adjustments to fighter direction, headset discipline, and plotting board etiquette that would, collected with others, harden into the sleek art the fleet would carry into the Santa Cruz and the Solomons. He ended it with a sentence no one would quote in a movie. Recommend early vectoring. Do not hoard AP. That one line would save lives he would never meet. And damage control, the ghosts in every ship's bones, found themselves, overnight, the subject of briefings and drills that officers now treated as sacred rather than dull. Men who had wedged oak shores under buckling frames in Yorktown drew diagrams on blackboards at recruit barracks and talked about counterflooding in the plain language of men who had done it when the deck was a hill. They showed photographs of bent stanchions and said, "This, gentlemen, is why paint and labeling matter. It is an irony of innovation that the glamour of carriers rests, finally, on the quiet heroism of plumbers." In Washington, a new hull, CV-10, sat half-born in the Newport Newsways. She had been laid down as Bonham Richard, a Revolutionary War name with salt in it. After Midway, the yard workers in the department in charge of names did what Americans do when memory burns hot. They renamed her Yorktown. The painter stenciled the letters with particular care, as if neatness mattered more when the name belonged to the dead. When CV-10 commissioned and sailed west, the chaplain spoke of duty, but on the mess decks the younger men said it another way. The old girl's back. They could be forgiven the superstition. Loyalty insists on persistence. Dixie Kiefer, the executive who had stood on the bridge wing and watched the skies saw and hammer his ship, went on to serve as executive officer in Enterprise and to collect wounds the way a ledger collects debits. Each line item proof that a man had stayed where he was supposed to. Buckmaster took a stateside billet for a time. Men who met him found him courteous, unsentimental, and still inclined to step to the edge of any platform that looked out over water. Pappy Dugan kept his ordnance shop neat enough to eat in, and when younger sailors joked about his fussing, he would say, "The ocean charges interest." In the Midway story that school children would learn later, maps, arrows, dates that reduced terror to tidy, Yorktown's 3-day resurrection sometimes took one line. That is history's economy, not its truth. In the steel and breath of it were 1,000 unphotographed miracles. A gasket turned on a lathe from a sketch. A brace seated by a woman with a sledge. A fuse cleaned by a kid who did not yet shave without nicking himself. The irony is elegant and hard. What seemed ridiculous on May 27th became essential on June 4th. Had the shipyard said no out of prudence, Midway may have written itself differently. Prudence can be expensive. Years later, a museum ship at Patriots Point would carry the Yorktown name, and visitors would step into a hangar that smelled of oil and old paint and popcorn, and look up an SBD hanging in a dive that never ends. Children would trace letters on a placard that said Midway, and their grandparents would stand quietly, hearing in the air a sound that isn't recorded anywhere. The hiss-a-so-too, the cough of a portable pump, the hammer beat of a shore being driven home. The guide would explain how fast the shipyard worked, and heads would shake in the universal language of, "That can't be right." The guide would smile and say, "It was on the piers at Pearl." The men and women who had run torches until their palms blistered went back to their benches. Ships kept coming, some limping, some merely tired, all of them hungry for attention the way living things are hungry for breath. A notice board near the shops added a second scrap of plate beneath the first. Hornet due. The work never slowed because the war never asked it to. If you want to locate Yorktown's true memorial, it is not only in the bronze plaques and the names cut into granite. It is in the way a radar plotter now speaks in short, exact phrases, in the way a plane captain runs his palm along a flap track and listens for a rattle, in the square knob of tow bridle and the clear stencil on a watertight door. It lives in the confidence with which a carrier deck crew takes a patch plate for granted because someone once made a miracle seem like a checklist. It lives in the fact that the fleet learned to survive and win with the ordinary brilliance of men and women whose names we only occasionally remember. On some mornings when the trade winds come through and the cranes are still, a yard worker might stand where Rose once stood and look at an empty berth. The water there is just water, yet if the light is right, you can almost see a shape, long, gray, purposeful, edging away into history. You can hear the klaxon. You can feel the deck rise under your boots. You can sense the question that hung over the harbor on May 27th, and the answer that came back a week later across 1,000 miles. Yes. Yorktown's gift to the Pacific War was not only her air group's courage or her captain's steadiness. It was a proof that time, brutal and short, can be captured and used when human hands decide that impossible is just bad arithmetic. The battle was won by admirals and pilots, by intelligence and luck, but its hinge swung on welders, fitters, machinists, and deck crews who refused to let the clock rule. The berth at Pearl is empty still, but the space is not nothing. It is a silhouette of what men and women can conjure out of noise and fear and iron filings. The ship that limped in on a broken Monday and sailed on a Thursday wrote her legacy in the grammar of work. The bridge that wasn't supposed to exist carried thousands of men across, and none of them ever knew the name of the man who made it possible.